560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Greta Thunberg is multiplying like a gremlin. In Montana, a public interest organization filed suit on behalf of more than a dozen kids, asking a state district court judge to strike down a law that would preclude the state of Montana from considering greenhouse gas emissions as part of project approvals. And the state district court judge, being a eco-supremacist herself, apparently, struck down the law. The plaintiffs can't claim any direct injuries traced to the states, to the law that was struck down, or even to climate change. In its filings, the state argued Montana is responsible for a rounding error in world greenhouse gas emissions, 0.0862%. But the data and even the implications of the data are no match for sad stories from teenagers like Grace, who says smoky air negatively impacts her ability to play competitive soccer.
Oh, you love soccer too.
And Georgie said her ability to compete and participate in Nordic skiing has been directly impacted by climate disruption. Although a climatologist for the state, in this case Judith Curry, who we profiled for you again earlier in the week after she did an interview with John Stossel, former head of atmospheric science at Georgia Tech. Judith Curry, in an analysis on behalf of the state, pointed out that most of the past 7 years have shown, quote, normal to above normal spring snowpack across Montana. But again, the reality is no match for Georgie's bitching about her ability to compete in Nordic skiing. So you have ideology running into the science and data. And guess what's winning?
And it's Montana, of all places.
You see, of course, the same thing playing out in Maui as government officials who fell down on the job, both in advance of the fire and during the crisis, are, starting with the governor there, Josh Green, are using climate change as the responsible party for what occurred. Let me give you one example we played earlier. Let's play him again because you should really hear it. I think it really drives it home. This M. Manuel, who is the deputy administrator for the Water and Natural Land Agency on the island of Maui. He gave this, this is not real time, but it gives you perspective of maybe why he was a little bit lethargic in providing the water to West Maui that it needed to combat the fires back more than a week ago before they had sort of ravaged the island. Listen to this Maui water official, Manuel.
The commission is responsible per our authorizing statute to protect and manage all water resources in the state. One Water is like taking it and looking at it from a holistic system perspective. And that's not any different than how Hawaiians traditionally managed water. You know, in essence, Native Hawaiians treated water as one of the earthly manifestations of a god and a kua, kane. And so that reverence for a resource and that reciprocity in relationship was something that was really, really important to our worldview and well-being, right? And living in an island, isolated from other, civilizations. And so I think where it shifted to today or over time is that we've become used to looking at water as like something which we use and not necessarily something that we revere as that thing that gives us life, right? I mean, to me, it's a shift in value set. And if we can start to really look at how we as humans in an island can reconnect to that traditional value set. So really my motto is always like, let water connect us and not divide us. Like we can share it, but it requires true conversations about equity.
Yeah, sorry, I can't have the conversation about equity right now because we got some fires, Manuel.
Oy.
More on this, please be joined by Patrick Moore. He is the co-founder of GreenPeace. He's also the author of Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Patrick Moore, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Nice to be with you, Dan.
What is your perspective after watching the last week of politicians in Maui and Hawaii explaining the causes? We know the impacts; those are not arguable, but the causes of the wildfires and the devastation of those wildfires in Hawaii.
Yeah, that was a lot of gobbledygook if I ever heard it before.
Yeah,
I mean, we don't need to talk about the religious aspect of water in a situation like this. I mean, it's just a shame that such things happen. But, fire is a double-edged sword of major proportions. Fire was basically the control of fire by humans was the beginning of human civilization in many ways. Our ability to use it for cooking and heating made it possible for us to come out of Africa, for example, because people forget that humans are a tropical species, and that's why a lot of people like living in Hawaii. It's a decent climate, whereas where I am here on Vancouver Island, there's still snow on the mountains, and it's late summer. And this is a climate where human beings could not live if it were not for fire, shelter, and clothing. And in all this talk about climate change and how the planet is heating up, we should take note of the fact that this is the Pleistocene ice age. That's why there's all this ice on the poles, because it's an ice age. And it started over 2 million years ago. Before that, for 200 million years, there was no ice on either pole, and the ancestors of our species lived just fine through that in the tropics. That's where our species came from the equator. Whereas other species like the polar bear, which didn't exist until a few 100,000 years ago, maybe 1 million years ago is when it evolved. As the Pleistocene ice age came on, the brown bear from Asia, part of them turned into polar bears because the ice got so heavy that it came right down to the shore of Russia, and the brown bears could go out on the ice and hunt for seals. And over time, they evolved into white instead of brown, into bigger, because big seals are hard to pull up out of the holes in the ice. And pretty soon you have two separate species, all because the Earth cooled down, not because it warmed up. And so we've got everything is so bass-ackward here in terms of what really is going on this Earth, because not only is it colder now than it has been for most of the history of the Earth, when there was no ice on the poles, but carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is lower now than it has been in the entire history of the Earth.
Wait. They just told us July was the hottest month in the history of the world.
Yes, well, that is the history of the world since about 1850. That's what they could get away with, that sort of, right? Because the world has been warming since 1600. 1600, around there, was the peak of the Little Ice Age, which was a cold period. The River Thames froze over on a regular basis in England. They had these huge winter carnivals out on the ice where they'd put up tents and have a good time, probably had a few beers. And this has not happened since 1814, the last time the River Thames froze over, as we came out of the Little Ice Age into what is called the modern warm period, which is now. But it's only warm relative to the fact that there have been 40 glacial advances covering the whole of Canada and half of Russia and much of Europe over the last 2.6 million years in the Pleistocene Ice Age. Anybody can read this. It's in Wikipedia. It's all over the internet. If you want to find out the history of the world's climate, you will find that you have to go all the way back to the medieval warm period, which peaked around 1,000 years ago, when the Vikings colonized Greenland, and there were thousands of people there farming at that time because it was warmer then than it even is now. And then you go back to the Roman warm period, 2,000 years ago, when the tree line in the Alps was nearly 1,000 feet higher than it is today, indicating that it was warmer then than it is today. So to say that this July was the warmest in the history of the Earth is so ridiculous that but people listen to it, and you know, you've got the media now trained to hyperbolate every single thing that happens with our climate, when in fact this is a pretty nice time climate-wise with regard to the Ice Age. At least the glacier isn't down in Montana like it was back then. You know, and this goes back. It takes millions of years for the Earth's climate to change this kind of radical way, and it's not changing radically now. It's changed by about 1 degree Celsius or 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 200 years.
I guess there's two questions to that. I mean, that statistic, and the Earth's been warming since 1600, as you say, as the temperature's been warming. So, number one, what are the implications of that warming? And number two, what, if anything, should we do about it? Or can we do about it?
The implications of that warming are that forests spread over a larger area because it's too cold for forests in the Antarctic and the Arctic now, whereas there were forests there before. All of Canada's Arctic islands were once forested with giant camels roaming in them, and many other wildlife as well, that have been lost because of the cold and ice coming during this Pleistocene Ice Age. Like, it's nearly 3 million years since the Earth plunged into this ice age. So it's no wonder people can't remember when it started, you know, but that is when it started. And that this was a new ice age, that there hadn't been an ice age for 250 million years before this one. The previous ice age is called the Karoo, Karoo. It lasted 100 million years. It's easy to look it up. Look up the Karoo Ice Age in the internet, and you'll find all kinds of interesting information about the fact that this ice age, it occurred during the Carboniferous period, when trees evolved. Before that, there were no trees. You know, it's hard to imagine a world without trees, but that's when they evolved.
Well, so should we don't just do something, stand there? Is that what we should do, or is there anything like specifically directed? Of course, obviously, we always want to be good stewards of of our natural resources, and we want to be responsible citizens and thoughtful. We want to innovate and make life better and easier and safer, and fewer people dying from weather events, whether they be cold or hot. And of course, we know more people die from cold. Bjorn Lundberg talks about this all the time. But is there any policy demand on us right now that we should be considering that is not being considered?
Well, nothing like what they're trying to push on us right now, because 10 times as many people die from cold as from heat. So we should be focused on making sure that people don't die from cold, because that's the biggest problem. The other fact is that way fewer people are dying from climate-related events, from weather-related events today than they did even 30 years ago, or especially 100 years ago. We have weather forecasts now that tell us when the rain is coming, when the wind is coming, when the heat is coming, when the cold is coming. We know ahead of time. We've got much better housing, at least in the developed world, where you're not in jeopardy of your house blowing down, any time there's a big wind. I mean, hurricanes, there's no getting away from them, but it's not as if they haven't been happening for the whole of the history of the Earth. And in fact, when the Earth warms, hurricanes go down. because hurricanes depend on the difference in temperature between the northern latitudes and the tropical latitudes, and the southern latitudes and the tropical latitudes. The difference in temperature is why those hurricanes are at those mid-latitudes. You don't have many hurricanes at the equator, and you don't have hurricanes up in the North Pole. Where you have the hurricanes is where the big temperature difference occurs between the tropics and the temperate regions. And when that gets reduced, when there's less temperature difference, because when the Earth warms, it warms more towards the poles. The equator stays pretty much the same. And anybody who knows meteorology knows this to be a fact, that it's a historical fact. And so we can expect, if the Earth does warm another degree or two, that there will be some reduction in the number and intensity of hurricanes.
Even
Whereas
if
they make it out as if the hurricanes are going to get worse when the world gets warmer. And the same thing about fire being caused by climate change, that is so stupid and ridiculous. Fire is caused by lightning, and fire is caused by humans. Now, for millions of years, lightning was the cause of forest fires because there were no humans playing with fire. But once you have humans with cigarette butts and campfires arson, and power lines, the campfire in California was such a complete unnecessary event. They built suburbs in the middle of a pitchy pine forest with the trees right practically smack up to the houses. In fact, the houses were burnt down, and many of the trees lived through that fire. But the houses were just burnt down right to the concrete foundation. And that was because of just stupid planning. And not, you look at Central Park in New York City. There's barely a coniferous tree in there because broadleaf trees like oaks and cherries and those, they're not pitchy. They don't burn like that. They don't have crown fires that when the wind comes just goes through them faster than animals and people can run. Whereas the firs and the pines and the spruces have a lot of pitch in them, and when the fire gets up into the needles, it just is an inferno. And you'd think by now there would be some people who understood that in the planning process of building suburbs in the forest, but no. Basically, a bunch of green idiots in the cities are making these rules for the parks and for the federal lands, and that's why the national forests and national parks in the West, which are federally controlled, are burning. Whereas in the southeast of the United States, we're all through Georgia and Alabama and East Texas, right to the Atlantic Ocean, there's just as much forest there as there is in the West, pretty well. And that's where the most timber is being harvested, and that's where there's hardly any forest fires because people are managing the forest properly. So the idea that climate change is responsible for the Hawaiian fires is just completely wrong. What's responsible there is a fire got started and there was a 50-mile-an-hour wind, and it doesn't seem as though there was very good reaction on the part of the authorities, and now they're making up all these excuses.
Right. If you wanted to reduce, a degree or two increase in temperature over the next century, if you wanted to prevent that, I'm not saying it's important to prevent it, could you? I mean, what impact does all the Biden regulations on dishwashers and washing machines and water heaters and generators, what impact does that have? Any?
As far as we know, zilch, because there is no proof that carbon dioxide in any way, shape, or form is responsible for the warming that is occurring today. If you look back into the history of the world, you will see that carbon dioxide and temperature are out of sync more often than they are in sync. It does not appear that carbon dioxide is a major factor whatsoever in the temperature of the Earth. Water vapor, ice, and clouds. It's interesting. Water is present in all three states on this planet as a gas, which is called humidity, as clouds and rain, which is liquid, and all of the oceans, 2/3 of the Earth covered in water, that is one of the major players in moderating the climate of our planet. And then there's ice, which is a solid. So water is present as a gas, a liquid, and a solid, and all those different states have different effects. And water is by far the most important greenhouse gas, as humidity. But also, the tops of clouds, they reflect light back into space from the sunlight back into space. It doesn't even get down here. And half the Earth is covered in clouds on the average day. So clouds are a major factor in controlling the temperature of the Earth. But when the clouds come over a piece of land, they become a blanket, stopping the heat from escaping from the Earth. The ice reflects a lot of light back into space, whereas dark soil absorbs more heat. So the whole balance of the temperature on planet Earth is very much more connected with water than it is with carbon dioxide in any way.
Really?
And they go on about methane and natural gas, and it is totally distorted and warped and has nothing to do with real science.
Patrick Moore, always in education. He is the co-founder of GreenPeace. He's also the author of Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Patrick Moore, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dan. On Amazon.com.
Okay, thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. Coming up on Chicago's Morning Answer, it's that time, Dan.
Open Mic Friday, 8:38, taking your calls, 312-642-5600, turnkey.pro answer line. Take your comments, compliments, concerns, criticisms, general crack pottery, all at 8:38.
But now let's head into the newsroom. Here is Mike Scott.
Amy and Dan, 8:32 is our time. And we're following a developing story here in Chicago overnight where at least 6 were robbed at gunpoint at multiple Northside locations. The circumstances surrounding the armed robberies are similar, with the victims describing the same weapon, vehicle, and number of offenders. The robbery spree began around 11:30 last night, ending about 2:45 this morning. People on the